Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I'd like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. We are back in another big political year. Parliament has kicked off again this week as we head into an election year. And it's not just an election year for federal politics, it's an election year for both South Australia and Victorian state governments too. There will obviously be a few videos over the coming weeks on all these big exciting things happening in Australian politics, and a video covering everything that has happened in Parliament House this sitting fortnight. But today I wanted to talk about something a little closer to home for me as a Canberran. The Convoy to Canberra. For those of you who don't know, thousands of people who are anti-mandate, anti-vaccines and other anti-things when it comes to how the government has handled the pandemic descended on Canberra just over 2 weeks ago. The aim was to protest the federal government about vaccine mandates, which has its own conversation piece, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the video. I'm not here today to argue whether or not vaccines work or whether or not mandates are fair, but in light of these self-proclaimed freedom protesters, I want to cover a video on what our rights are in Australia under law. To start with, it is very important to recognise that in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights, such as exists in the United States. I do often hear people talk about their right to free speech or right to bear arms. Unfortunately, that's just too much American TV and movies. We don't actually have those rights in Australia as such. We have laws in our constitution, but we are also party to some international treaties. In these treaties, we have certain rights. So given this is a channel about politics, I wanted to cover today specifically the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This covenant was entered into force for Australia on November 13th, 1980. There are 53 articles in this treaty which spell out a number of political rights and also basic human rights. I wanted to focus in on just a small handful today in relation to the events that are happening in Canberra at the moment. The first is the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief. This right can be found in Article 18 of the ICCPR and allows people to think freely, have their own ideas, and believe or not believe in the religion or set of convictions of their choice. This means that people should be protected against brainwashing and indoctrination. When it comes to the right to religious beliefs, this also includes the ability to practice these beliefs, including through observance, worship, and teaching. The right to freedom of religion, for instance, overrides something like compulsory military service if the religion prohibited someone from participating. There are certain times, however, where this right can be limited. These instances include to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. For example, all railway workers must wear protective headgear for safety purposes while working, even if this means that a religious head covering cannot be worn simultaneously. The next right I want to talk about is the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This is the right that relates to the idea of free speech. However, we don't use the term free speech here, we use the term freedom of expression. And you'll see that this right is not absolute. Article 19 of the ICCPR allows people to hold opinions. This right is absolute. If you 100% have the opinion that the sky is green or that pineapple belongs on pizza, all power to you. That's your opinion and no one can take that away from you. You have complete freedom to have that opinion. Opinion turns into expression when that opinion is voiced either orally or in writing. This is where the limitations come in. While you are free to have opinions about pineapple on pizza, there may be a limitation to you expressing those opinions. The right to freedom of expression includes unpopular and unconventional ideas. This, however, does not include opinions which impede on the rights or reputations of others, affect national security, public order, public health, or morals. For example, you cannot speak negatively about someone in a way that would ruin their reputation. This is defamation and is a limitation to freedom of expression. So if I were to say Bob is a total loser and he treats people poorly, that would be considered a time when my freedom of expression was restricted because it damages Bob's reputation. However, if I said I know a guy who is a total loser and treats people poorly, I would have the freedom to say that because no one knows I'm speaking about Bob. Well, I guess you do now. But you get my point. I don't even know a guy called Bob. Oh wait, yes I do. Sorry Bob, I'm not talking about you. You're a great guy. Another rights and reputations case that has come before the Human Rights Commission previously is the denial of the Holocaust. So you were free in Australia to hold the opinion that the Holocaust did not happen. However, you do not have the freedom to express that opinion because it impinges on the respect of the rights and reputations of others. The limitation of national security means you cannot transmit information which would put the security of the nation in danger. This includes official secrets. The next limitation is around public order, which means the smooth running and peacefulness of our society. So if you are saying something which is encouraging crime, violence, or mass panic, you can actually have your freedom of expression limited in relation to this. The most interesting of all the limitations is the limitation around public health. Now, this hasn't actually been tested as of yet. I wouldn't be surprised if a case comes before the Human Rights Committee in the coming months on this. Of course, the government stance on this public health crisis is that vaccinations, masks, hand sanitizing, and social distancing are our only way to protect ourselves from the virus. For those who oppose this view and encourage others to come on board with their beliefs, it puts the government's public health response at risk. So could anti-vaccination or anti-mask sentiment actually end up a limitation when it comes to freedom of expression? Watch this space. Now for the topical one that relates to what is happening in Canberra at the moment. The right to freedom of assembly and association. So your right to protest is actually called your right to freedom of assembly. This right allows people to meet and engage in peaceful protests. The key word there being peaceful. None of these rights apply to assemblies or protests involving violence. The aim of this right is to allow people to exchange ideas and information and express their views publicly. Anyone can gather publicly despite how unpopular their opinion might be received by the rest of the public. For example, Canberra is one of the most vaccinated cities not only in Australia but in the world. There are a small handful of Canberrans that would be supportive of the messaging behind the protests happening here at the moment. But just because we are a highly vaccinated city, it doesn't mean that the protesters have any less right to choose Canberra as their venue for protesting. They just might not be met with the same public support as another city or another country. The right to association allows people to form and join groups, networks, communities, and associations to pursue common objectives. These include political parties, clubs, and trade unions. When it comes to international law, there is no clarity around whether or not the right exists to not join an association. For example, if you are feeling coerced into joining a club, do you have the right to say no? However, in Australia, the Fair Work Act ensures that people are free to not become members of associations such as trade unions. The limitations to the rights to freedom of assembly and association are again in relation to national security, public safety, public order, the protection of public health or morals, or the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. This is where the protests in Canberra over the past 2 weeks have been a bit messy. Firstly, the protesters have restricted the rights and freedoms of others. There have been workplaces that have told staff not to come in due to the security risk of the protesters, especially those who have been found to have weapons on them at the protests. Just this morning, a charity book fair was shut down in Canberra due to a security breach of the protesters overnight. Last weekend, a business was targeted for complying with police instructions to tow the vehicles of protesters who were trespassing at the time, and that business was review bombed on Google. In this, I'm not saying all the protesters are impeding on the freedom of others. However, if the assembly is starting to be subject to the limitations laid out in the treaty, that is when the assembly is at risk of being shut down. It is also interesting that there is a limitation on the right to assembly and association when it comes to public health. I can't find an instance where this limitation has been tested, and I assume it probably hasn't been, but I would be interested to know if this instance does get brought before the Human Rights Commission in the future, with a question around whether or not an anti-mandate and anti-vaccination assembly is not in the interest of the protection of public health. Now, I want to share a piece of advice that is separate from any of these rights to civil and political freedoms. When protesting, please make sure you're protesting to the right people. Vaccination mandates are implemented by state and territory governments across the country. They are not a federal government decision. If you are protesting about certain issues, you need to ensure you are choosing the appropriate level of government to which to protest. I think it has been one of those aspects of all this convoy to Canberra that has probably exacerbated the situation in Canberra. So a lot of locals are public servants and know quite a bit about how the government functions. And with freedoms of Canberrans being affected by the protesters who are protesting to the inappropriate level of government about a topic almost 99% of Canberrans don't agree with, tensions in the city are high, to say the least. So, as a recap, we are party to an international covenant on civil and political rights. There are many rights included in this, but the few we covered today include the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to assembly and association. Please like and subscribe to my channel, put a comment below if you have any questions or feedback, and I will hopefully see you next week with another video covering what has happened in Parliament House over the last sitting fortnight. Thank you, bye!